Our next speaker, Eugene Valberg, received his PhD from the State University of New York at Buffalo, and he taught philosophy in the United States for about 10 years before heading for more exotic climes. And from 1976 to 1988, he taught in universities in Africa and Papua New Guinea, until something that is unfortunately all too common in our circles happened to him. His views on race were published in a newspaper, against his permission, by the way, and he suddenly found himself forced to change careers. But since that time, Dr. Valberg has lived in Johannesburg, South Africa, where he's self-employed in various professions. Dr. Valberg, in fact, shares the distinction with only myself and Sam Dixon as being the only person who actually spoke at the very first American Renaissance Conference in 1994. Good for him. I should say we three are the only ones here today. Now, I had become acquainted with Dr. Valberg through his absolutely fascinating book called Racism, Guilt, Self-Hatred, and Self-Deceit, which is an extraordinary account of the racial wisdom he's accumulated in various offbeat parts of the world. The book is available by internet, and also if you speak to Dr. Valberg, he'll be happy to tell you how to get a copy. So I'm very pleased that Dr. Valberg has agreed to return to the AR podium and once again share his insights. So please, if you would, welcome Eugene Valberg.
My first inklings regarding African languages arose from a conversation with students in Nigeria about a coconut in a tree and how to say where it was. I said, how would you say that it's about halfway up the tree? And they simply said, you can't say that. All you can say is that it's up. I said, how about it's all the way up? He said, it doesn't matter. All you can say is up. In other words, there's no sense of gradations. A few years later in Nairobi, two women expressed surprise when they saw that I had an English dictionary. Isn't English your language? They said, yes, it's my only language. Well, then why do you need a dictionary? In short, they were puzzled that I needed an English dictionary, and I was puzzled at their puzzlement. I said, there are always times, I said, when you come across a word that you don't know, and so you look it up in a dictionary. They said, but if English is your language, how can there be words you don't know? I said, well, what do you mean? There's always, no one knows all the words in their language. And they responded, but we know all the words in our language. Every Kikuyu, which was their language, every Kikuyu does. I said, what? I was really surprised. And then it dawned on me that being an entirely oral language, which had never been written, they would have to know all the words in their language, because a non-written oral language only exists in the minds of the speakers of that language. Whereas in a language like English, which is written down, the language expands indefinitely and is much greater than one person could possibly know. So that if the words in Kikuyu weren't known by the speakers, they couldn't be anywhere else, because where else could they be besides in the minds of these speakers? Which means that a non-written language has basically a finite size and is basically static. But if the size of a language is limited, it follows that the concepts in that language are also going to be limited. And therefore that the language and the thinking of such people is going to be impoverished. Of course, it is impoverished only in relation or comparison to a language like English. African languages were of necessity sufficient in their pre-colonial context. while numerous dictionaries have been compiled between European and African languages, there are very few intra-African language dictionaries. I've seen a Zulu dictionary. It is a small format paperback, 252 pages long. My queries into Zulu began when I rang the African language department at a university in Johannesburg and got to a white guy. I asked whether precision existed in pre-contact Zulu, in other words, in indigenous Zulu. He said, "Oh, that's a very Eurocentric question," and he wouldn't answer it. I called again, spoke to another white guy, got exactly the same answer. So I called UNISA in Pretoria. I spoke to a young black guy. What was the Zulu entry for precision? He said, "to make like a straight line." Was this part of indigenous Zulu? No, he said, that was added. As has been my experience in Africa, we got along like a house afire. I explained my interest in Zulu. We found my questions very interesting. Abstract concepts are usually intangible and cannot be perceived by the senses. The number 7 is prime. Its primeness, however, cannot be seen, felt, or heard. It can only be perceived by the mind. Abstract entities are often things which do not exist. What would happen if everyone threw rubbish everywhere refers to something which hopefully will not happen. Nevertheless, we can think about what would happen if everyone did that. Everything we observe occurs in time, and everything we see exists in space, yet we cannot perceive either time or space with our senses, only with the mind. Precision is also abstract. While we can see and touch things made with precision, precision itself can only be grasped by the mind. So how do we acquire abstract concepts? Is it enough, for example, that we make things with precision to have the concept of precision? Africans make excellent carvings, clearly made with precision. So why isn't the word in their language? Well, to have the concept of precision, we must not only deal with precision, but we must become aware that there is such a thing as precision and then give it a name. How do we acquire such concepts as belief and doubt? We all have beliefs. Even animals have belief. When a dog wags its tail when he hears his master is coming, he believes that his master is coming. But it has no concept of belief because it has no awareness that it has this belief, and so has no awareness of belief per se. In short, it has no self-consciousness. It is not aware of this state of mind. A rat conditioned to expect food after pressing a bar, but who then finds that sometimes it doesn't come, will begin doubting that the bar will bring food. But it doesn't have a concept of doubt precisely because it lacks the self-consciousness to become aware of this state of mind, which we call doubt. I observed early on that blacks generally lack self-consciousness. If self-consciousness, self-awareness is a sine qua non for developing abstract concepts, it is not surprising that black languages are deficient in abstract terms. This lack of introspection, in fact, has its advantages. It has been my experience that neurotic behavior, characterized by excessive and unhealthy self-consciousness, a rat conditioned to expect food after pressing a bar, but who then finds that sometimes it doesn't come, will begin doubting that the bar will bring food. But it doesn't have a concept of doubt precisely because it lacks the self-consciousness to become aware of this state of mind, which we call doubt. I observed early on that blacks generally lack self-consciousness. If self-consciousness, self-awareness is a sine qua non for developing abstract concepts, it is not surprising that black languages are deficient in abstract terms. This lack of introspection, in fact, has its advantages. It has been my experience that neurotic behavior, characterized by excessive and unhealthy self-consciousness, is less common amongst blacks. Several psychiatrists that I've spoken to confirm this. Insofar as blacks lack self-consciousness, they will obviously have less unhealthy self-consciousness and therefore less neuroses. I'm also confident that sexual dysfunction characterized by such self-consciousness and foisted upon men by feminism is also uncommon amongst black men. After discussing precision with this black guy at this university in Pretoria, I was assured by him that it was otherwise with promise. I said, how about obligation? We looked it up. The Zulu entry means as if to bind one's feet. No, he says, that was added. In other words, it wasn't in Zulu prior to European contact. But if Zulu didn't contain the concept of obligation, how could it contain the word promise, since a promise is simply the oral undertaking of an obligation? For him, this was a light bulb experience. I thought I was interested because Africans so often fail to keep promises and never apologized, as if they had nothing to apologize for. Yes, he said, the Zulu word for promise, isitembiso, is not the correct word. When a black person promises, he said, he means maybe I will, maybe I won't. I said, but this makes nonsense of promising, whose very raison d'etre is to bind one to a course of action. When one is not sure he can do something, he may say, well, I will try, but I can't promise. He said he'd heard whites say that and had never understood it until now. In other words, as a young Romanian friend so aptly summed it up, when a black person promises, he means, I'll try. To explain this failure to keep promises as a linguistic problem is far-fetched. It is hard to believe that living with whites for so long that they could not learn the correct meaning, and it is too much of a coincidence that the same thing occurs in Nigeria, Kenya, and Papua New Guinea, places where I've also lived. Much more likely they lack the very concept and hence cannot give the word its correct meaning. But why do they lack this concept? That none of these cultures have the concept, and that the people so often fail to learn them seems to indicate an intellectual incapacity. Note the huge significance of this definition of obligation, as if to bind one's feet. An obligation binds you, but it does so morally, not physically. It is abstract. You can't see it, you can't hear it, or touch it, which of course is precisely why there's no such word in Zulu. So what have these authors of this dictionary done? They've taken an abstract concept, obligation, and made it concrete. Feet, rope, tying are all tangible and observable. And therefore, they are things that all blacks will fully understand, precisely as they will not all understand what an obligation is. The fact that they had to define obligation in this way is therefore by itself compelling evidence for my thesis that Zulu thought lacks abstract concepts, and indirectly for my claim that blacks are deficient in abstract thinking. My thinking about blacks and time began in 1988 as I pulled into my garage. Several francophone Africans drove up and stopped right in front of my car. Hey, I said, you can't park here. Perfectly friendly and respectful, as I've known for a long time black Africans are. They asked me, oh, are you leaving now? No, I said, but saying what should have been the utterly obvious, I might want to leave sometime later. Park over there, and they did. The point is, their thinking seemed to encompass only the here and now. If you're leaving now, we understand, but otherwise, what's the problem? I had many other such encounters, and the key question was always, are you leaving now? The future does not exist. It will exist, but it doesn't exist now. Hence, people who have difficulty in thinking of things which do not exist will ipso facto have difficulty in thinking of the future. It appears that the Zulu entry for future, isikati, is the same word as the word for time, as well as the word for space. In other words, none of these concepts exist in Zulu thought, period. It appears also that there's no word for the past, meaning the time preceding the present. This should not be surprising, since the past no longer exists, just as the future does not yet exist. So people who have difficulty in thinking of things which do not exist will have difficulty in thinking the past as well as the future, since neither exists. This has an obvious bearing on such things as gratitude, something I've long noticed is not common amongst blacks. You might wonder why it took me so long, why it took me more than 20 years to notice this phenomenon. Briefly, I think it is because our assumptions about time are so bedrock that we're not even aware of having them. And therefore, we are not aware of the possibility that there might be some people who don't have them, who don't make these assumptions about time. Therefore, it's just not on our radar, and so, of course, we don't see it. An article in the South African press in 2002 notes the problems that blacks have with mathematics. Quote, Xhosa, another major language in South Africa, is a language where polygon and plane have the same definition. Words like triangle, quadrilateral, pentagon, hexagon are defined by only one word. End of quote. In other words, it is a language in which these concepts simply do not exist. In America, blacks are said to have a, quote, tendency to approximate space, numbers, and time, instead of aiming for complete accuracy, end of quote. In other words, they are also poor at math. In other words, 7 times 7 is about 50. Notice the identical triumvirate of abstract concepts, space, numbers, and time, none of which can be seen, heard, or touched. Is it just a coincidence that these concepts, with which blacks everywhere have such difficulties? The Zulu entry for number, by the way, ningi, means numerous, which is not at all the same as the concept of number. It is clear, therefore, that there's no such concept as number in Zulu. White rule in South Africa ended in 1994. It was about 10 years later that power outages started, which has recently reached epidemic proportions. One cause of this is deliberate load shedding, precisely because the Zulu government, the ANC government, which was specifically warned by government parastatal in 1999 to build more power plants, did not. Enough said. The other is the breakdown ended in 1994. It was about 10 years later that power outages started, which has recently reached epidemic proportions. One cause of this is deliberate load shedding, precisely because the Zulu government, the ANC government, which was specifically warned by government parastatal in 1999 to build more power plants, did not. Enough said. The other is the breakdown of existing power plants due to lack of maintenance. Maintenance is future-oriented, and the Zulu entry for maintenance is ondla, which means nourish, rear, bring up, keep an eye on, watch your crop. In short, there's no such thing as maintenance in Zulu thought. It would be hard to argue that the absence of the concept of maintenance has nothing to do with the fact that throughout Africa, the phrase "nothing works" is only an exaggeration. The New York Times reveals that New York City is considering a plan since implemented at getting blacks to do well on standardized tests and to show up for class, which could earn them as much as $500 a year. Adults would be rewarded for keeping a full-time job, having health insurance, and attending parent-teacher conferences. Students would be paid for doing well on tests and sometimes just for taking them, as well as for regular attendance and for each book they read. The clear implication is that blacks are not very motivated. Motivation involves thinking about the future and hence thinking about things which do not exist. Given black deficiencies in this regard, it is not surprising that they would be lacking in motivation, and having to prod them in this way is just further evidence for this. The Zulu entry for motivate is banga, under which I find in the dictionary, make, cause, produce something unpleasant, to cause trouble, contend over a claim, fight over inheritance, make for, aim at, journey. But when I ask blacks what banga means, they have no idea, which tells me that whatever it means, it does not mean motivation. Clearly, this is a substitute definition, finding the closest Zulu word as opposed to a constructed definition as if to bind one's feet. In fact, no Zulu word could refer to motivation for the simple reason that there is no such concept in Zulu. And if there's no such concept, there cannot be a word for it, precisely because in Zulu there is no it for motivation. All of which it helps explain the need to entice blacks into behaving as if they were motivated. The entry for ambition is langazela, which means simply desire or longing. Compare this to the Encarta dictionary. Desire for success, a strong feeling of wanting to be successful in life and achieve great things, which is in fact a good description of exactly what blacks so frequently lack. One explanation for this lack of abstract thinking, including the diminished understanding of time, is that blacks evolved in a climate where they could live day to day without having to think ahead. They never developed the ability to think of things which do not exist, precisely because there was never any need to. Whites, on the other hand, evolved in circumstances where they had to develop this ability. Like what would happen if we don't build stout houses and store enough food and fuel for the winter? For them, it was either sink or swim. Fortunately for us, they swam. The New York Times article mentions Darwin Davis of the Urban League as cautioning that the money offered for this attending class, remember, was relatively paltry, wondering how many tests would they need to pass to buy the latest video game. Instead of being shamed by the need for such a plan, he bitches that it's not enough. If he is unaware of how gross his remark is, he is morally obtuse. Even so, you would still expect him to know that most people would find it offensive. In fact, however, this is precisely how blacks often do understand morality, as what others tell them or expect them to do. Yet for many blacks, even this externally based morality has failed to take hold, which makes sense, because this external type morality is dependent on enforcers. But since these have long since disappeared, there is nothing left, neither the internalized morality, the real thing, or the external form. In the early 1990s, I heard of an American linguist who had spent many years in Senegal studying their languages and who made some remarkable discoveries. Whereas Western cultures internalize norms, don't do that to a child because I mustn't do that for an adult. African cultures did not. There were only external trolls from tribal elders and so forth. When they were detribalized, these external constraints disappeared. Since there were never any internal constraints, you get the result of this lack of self-control, crime, drugs, promiscuity. Where there has been some substitute control, as in white ruled South Africa, colonial Africa, or the segregated American South, this behavior was kept within tolerable limits. But when even such controls disappear, you typically see indiscriminate and unbridled violence. What this linguist never asked was why African cultures didn't internalize moral norms. That is, why they never developed moral consciousness. That it was just an historical accident seems implausible. More likely it results from fundamental deficiencies, specifically in abstract thinking ability. In an article in the Boston Review, a distinction is made between conventional and moral rules. Conventional rules are merely supported by authority and can be changed. Moral rules, on the other hand, are not subject to such change and are not based on conventional authority. Quote, even 3-year-old children distinguish between moral and conventional transgressions. The only exception, according to James Blair of the NIH, are psychopaths, those exhibiting persistent aggressive behavior. For them, all rules are based on external authority in whose absence anything is permissible. The conclusion is that healthy individuals in all cultures respect the distinction between conventional and moral rules. At least one anthropologist, however, argues that the special status of moral rules cannot be part of human nature, but is just an artifact of Western values. From the same article. Speaking of the Manyika in Zimbabwe, Anita Jacobson-Whitting says, I tried to find a word that would correspond to the English concept of morality. I explained what I meant by asking informants to describe the norms for good behavior towards other people. The answer was unanimous. The word for this was tsika. But when I asked my informants to translate tsika into English, they said it was good manners. In short, according to her, they did not have a concept of morality. But if awareness of the difference between moral and conventional rules is virtually universal, how does one explain its absence in these two widely separated black societies, Senegal and Zimbabwe? Jacobson-Whitting's explanation is the typical nonsense that could only come from an intellectual. The concept of morality simply does not exist. More likely is that the concept of morality, while otherwise universal, is enfeebled specifically in black cultures, precisely because of deficiency in abstract thinking. The concept of morality may well be universal in healthy populations, but among psychopathic groups, to use James Blair terms, where anything is permissible, and where you find the violence and mayhem present in black populations, lacking externally imposed authority, the concept of morality may indeed be absent, and that would certainly qualify them as unhealthy. Is there a problem with the loudspeaker?
Try this. Try that.
By the way, the notion... Oh. Want me to start over again? I don't care.
Where you left off.
Okay. By the way, the notion that blacks are children in adult bodies is not without foundation. Too much? Okay. The notion that blacks are children in adult bodies is not without foundation. The average African IQ has the raw IQ score of the average 11-year-old white child. And this phenomenon of not internalizing moral norms is another illustration of the same idea, since this is precisely how white children typically understand morality. Don't do this, don't do that. Something similar is obviously true vis-a-vis the concept of law. Legal rules are man-made and can be changed, though they are generally founded on moral principles. Given what we've already said, it would not be surprising if blacks didn't regard laws as external commands. So being against the law means don't do that. This explains why blacks so often either slavishly and inflexibly enforce rules, allowing no possible exceptions, or simply ignore them altogether. In short, blacks frequently have at best a very limited grasp of what a law is, and therefore what rule of law means. The continent of Africa is one massive illustration of this. What is the explanation for all of this? From a South African book review in 1993. A Cape social worker sees elements that revel in violence. It's like a cult which has embraced a lot of people who otherwise appear normal. At the slightest provocation, their bloodlust is aroused. And then they want to see death. And they jeer and mock at the suffering involved, especially the suffering of a slow and agonizing death. End of quote. There's something so unspeakably vile and repulsive about this, something so beyond depravity the human brain recoils. This is not merely the absence of human sympathy, but the positive enjoyment of human suffering. All the more so when it's slow and agonizing. Can you believe jeering and mocking at such a thing? A letter writer describes necklacing. Quote, the petrol-filled tire is jammed on your shoulders and a lighter is placed within reach. Your fingers are broken, needles are pushed up your nose, and you are tortured until you put the lighter to the petrol yourself. From the Chicago Tribune about Rwanda. The ecstasy of killing, the lust for blood, this is the most horrible thought. It's beyond my reach. The lack of moral consciousness is further evidenced by their videotaping their crimes, apparently wanting to record it for posterity. Unlike Nazi war criminals, for example, who went to great lengths to hide their deeds, these people took pride in their work. A retired Afrikaner journalist discusses the Amy Beale trial. She was an American brutally murdered trying to help blacks. Quote, it is impossible to explain in terms accessible to the rational mind this extract from a report of the trial. Quote, supporters of the three men accused of murdering her burst into laughing when a witness told how the battered woman had groaned in pain, pleading for her life. I have long suspected that the concept of rape cannot mean the same in Africa as elsewhere. From Newsweek around July 2000. According to a 3-year study in Johannesburg, more than half of the young people interviewed, both male and female, believed that forcing sex with someone you know does not constitute sexual violence. The casual manner in which South African teens discuss coercive relationships and unprotected sex is staggering. End of quote. The writer is puzzled by blacks' conduct regarding age, asking, why has the safe sex effort failed so abjectly? Well, aside from their profoundly different attitudes towards sex and violence and their heightened libido, a major factor has to be their diminished concept of time and their inability to think ahead, resulting in a just don't give a damn attitude. Nevertheless, I was still surprised by what I found in the dictionary. The main entry reads, act hurriedly, be greedy, rob, plunder, take possessions by force. While these entries are related to our concept of rape, there's one small problem. There is no reference to sexual intercourse. In a male-dominated culture where often saying no is not an option, as illustrated by the previous study just mentioned, taking sex by force is not really part of their mental calculus. Furthermore, rape clearly has a moral dimension. To the extent that blacks do not consider coerced sex to be wrong, then by our conception, they cannot consider it rape, because rape is bad. If such behavior isn't bad, it isn't rape. But why don't they think coercive sex is wrong? To the extent there's no option of saying no, then from their perspective, it isn't really forced in the first place. And to the extent that blacks are deficient in moral consciousness, they will have difficulty in understanding that even unambiguously coercive sex is wrong in the first place. Either way, there appears to be no place for our notion of rape. I recently saw a few minutes of a TV program in South Africa where the topic of conversation was having sex for money. Of the several women in the audience who spoke up, not a single one questioned the morality of this. Indeed, one plaintively asked, why else would I have sex with a man? Clearly indicating that she could not imagine any other reason. This and other experiences of mine clearly leaves little doubt in my mind that the notion of romantic love is generally alien to blacks, and I would be very surprised if it were different in America. In teaching ethics, I would use the example of Alfred Dreyfus, a Jewish officer in the French army who in the late 19th century was convicted of treason even though the authorities knew he was innocent. Admitting this mistake, it was said, would have a disastrous effect on military morale and would cause great social unrest. I would in turn argue that certain things are wrong, not because of their consequences, but are intrinsically so. Even if the consequences of freeing him would be disastrous, and much worse than letting him stay in prison, he must be freed because it is unjust to keep an innocent man in prison. To my amazement, however, when I discussed this in a class in Kenya, every single student said he should not be freed. In all my years of teaching, I'd never seen this response. Blacks, I believe, generally lack the concepts of subjunctivity and counterfactuality. Examining the Zulu dictionary indicates there is no concept of fact, which would seem to rule out the concept of counterfactuality. The entry for fact reads, a single word, saying, sentence, syllable, detail, meaning that none of these concepts exist in Zulu, including detail. And note, by the way, that one cannot be aware of precision without being aware of detail. Subjunctivity is conveyed in such statements as, what would you have done if I hadn't showed up on time? This is counterfactual because you did show up on time. Moreover, these things now could not happen. Yet we're asking the person to imagine what he would have done if something which didn't happen and now couldn't happen had happened. Among other things, this clearly requires self-consciousness, blacks' lack of which we have already discussed. A friend tried to persuade his workers to contribute to a health insurance policy. What's it for, they asked. Well, if you get sick, it would pay for the hospital. Their response was immediate. But boss, we're not sick. Yes, but what if you got sick? Reply, we're not sick. End of story. There are, however, circumstances in which blacks do think of the future. For example, they plan for their funerals. Notice, however, that death is a certainty, while ill health is only a risk. A notion that involves risk, a notion that involves subjectivity, probability, and matters of degree. The Zulu entry for risk, by the way, is danger and a slippery surface. Given the all-or-nothing nature of black thinking, if it is not certain that you will be ill, you will not be ill. Further, death is observable. Even those with only a limited grasp of the future know that people die, that crops grow, children become adults, etc. But note that these things are all concrete. Plants growing, people aging are observable. In short, blacks tend to be aware of time when it is manifested in the concrete and observable. One of the pivotal ideas underpinning morality is the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. How would you feel if someone stole everything you own? Well, that's how you would feel if someone robbed you. The subjectivity here is obvious, but if blacks generally lack the capacity to think of subjectivity, they will have difficulty in understanding the golden rule, and hence, therefore, in understanding many aspects of morality. Given this, we might expect their capacity for empathy to be diminished, and this is evident in the examples already cited. After all, how do we empathize? When we hear of things like necklacing, we instinctively and unconsciously ask ourselves, how would I feel if that were me? But of course, I am not and cannot be that person. Yet this thought experiment, what if that were me, provides us with valuable moral information that we wouldn't want this to happen to us, and therefore we shouldn't want it to happen to others. To the extent that people are deficient in such abstract thinking ability, they will be deficient in moral understanding and hence in human empathy, which is precisely what we independently observe. In his book, Devil's Night, Zev Shafetz quotes a black woman in Detroit. Quote, "I know some people won't like this, but whenever you get a whole lot of black people, you're going to have problems. Blacks are ignorant and rude." End of quote. A few years ago, a black friend invited me to her house. There was a group of women sitting in a circle chatting, all working at the same bank as my friend, and fluent in English. Even though I'd been invited by their host and had been introduced to them, they went right on speaking Zulu, knowing I spoke not a word of it. Hard to imagine, right? How to explain this? Well, most people simply couldn't be that rude to speak a language that someone doesn't know, they don't speak it, go right on speaking your language. Most persons wouldn't be rude. They know that this person would be uncomfortable, and that were this to happen to them, they wouldn't like it. And so, putting themselves in the other person's shoes, they wouldn't do it to him. In short, the golden rule: don't do unto others as you wouldn't have them do unto you. So why would a room full of black people behave this way? Simple. Deficient in the ability to think counterfactually. How would I feel if that were me? It just does not occur to them that this other person will be uncomfortable. They will be unaware of the nature of their behavior because of the inability to think counterfactually. Not long ago, I was speaking to a black woman, a manager in a business store, about a headache remedy of mine that she wanted to sell. All the time there was a customer hanging about, waiting to speak to her. Finally, he interrupted us. Without a word, she walked off with him. It was certainly right for her to take care of business before personal business. But normally a person would say, "Sorry, I got to take care of this, I'll be right back." She just walked off. Why? Her behavior simply illustrated rudeness and the lack of availability to think abstractly. A friend raised the question of how this woman would have felt if someone behaved this way towards her, suggesting that she might have been insulted or felt bad at all. And she was quite right. She would not have been bothered because when all is said and done, what?
2 minutes.
Oh. What I'm saying is blacks have no concept of rudeness. you could easily say that when they are rude, they do not know, they don't know they're being rude, and from their perspective, they're not being rude. Finally, I just want to mention something about littering. I have a long quote from a book by Walt Harrington, a white guy married to a black woman with 2 half-black children. He's driving somewhere and he sees a car in front of him, throw out a bag of rubbish out of the car. He says to himself, I'll bet they're black. And then he's ashamed of himself. He says, I'm married to a black woman. He drives up, sure enough, they are black. Then he relates an incident where he's driving into a McDonald's drive-in, and he sees the car in front of him as 4 blacks. He says, oh, we're going to be waiting here forever. He says, again, I'm being racist. Why? They do wait forever. They're changing their order, arguing with each other, and how do you explain black littering? Is there anyone I think that can explain why blacks in Africa and in America and everywhere litter? The answer is by now pretty obvious. Why? If you want to know why blacks litter, you must ask why whites don't as much. We have learned from sometime at an early age to think subliminally, subconsciously, what would happen if everyone just threw stuff wherever they wanted to. It'd be a mess. We don't. Blacks are relatively incapable of thinking like that. If people are incapable of thinking like that, that idea, that behavior is unlikely to arise in their culture. Simple as that.
Couple of questions.
Shout? All right, I'll shout it out. All right.
Don't be rude.
I won't be. Dr. Valberg, welcome to a fellow New Yorker. I actually wrote this question down. The program you're talking about, New York City, about paying students and parents. Now, I'm teaching a...
It's been implemented, I believe.
Yes, well, let me explain. First off, that's the only thing to be grateful for is that right now is private money. So that's not taxpayer money yet, but I'm sure it'll get there. Okay? I was on the New York City School Board, which is the public schools, for 12 years. I teach now in a private school. My question to you is, and by the way, I'm administrator in the private schools. I'm in charge of discipline and student affairs, a fun job. Now, big problem is that many students simply don't show up to school and show up whenever they feel like it, and the truancy rate is very low. In other words, the parents are enablers. And it's sort of a cultural, they don't feel that they're doing anything wrong. And I'm on the phone, it's like, why don't you get your kid to school? And they feel it's not a big deal. My question to you is, in Africa, what is the mentality about, the attitude about going to school, making sure you're at school, parents making sure that their kids are at school, and the idea that you should be working hard, getting yourself there, and studying and being punctual? What is the mentality about all
Well,
that?
I can't really speak in detail, not having children to send to schools. I do know that, of course, immediately at the end of white rule, tens of thousands of black parents wanted to send their children to previously all-white schools, government schools, right? And they did. And what I do know is that once these schools became like 40, 50, 60% black, of course, the theft, petty crime, skyrocketed. You couldn't leave something for 2 minutes. And eventually, when they got 80% black, these black parents, often working class, domestic servants, took their kids out of those schools because they were too black. They didn't know, they no longer wanted to send their kids there because it was exactly what they were trying to get away from. And the same thing with residential neighborhoods. They all want to live in a white neighborhood. They all go there. It's no longer a white neighborhood, and then they leave. So it's like the paradox of integration. When you want to, get blacks want to get into a white neighborhood or white school, it becomes black. As far as I know, there's still a lot of, they want to go to a white school, but they don't know what education is. They just know. Their attitude towards education is a kind of black witchcraft. They believe that education is the white man's magic. You go to school, especially university, you get a piece of paper called a diploma. That doesn't represent you've learned anything, because they don't understand that you have knowledge and skills. They don't understand that. All they know is what whites tell them. University diploma is a ticket to success. Meaning, to them, it's a talisman. It's a magical piece of paper. You get that piece of paper, and you're going to be rich and powerful. So to them, it wouldn't matter if someone cheats and makes a phony document. It's exactly as good as getting a real one, because it means you have the magical piece of paper. So they still do want the children to go to schools. They want them to be educated, but really they don't know what that means.
Yeah, this
Beyond getting this magical piece of paper.
This is a fascinating conversation. It could go on a long time, but we're going to have to stick to our schedule here. So please.
If you'd like to contact American Renaissance, you may write American Renaissance at Post Office Box 527, Oakton, Virginia 22124. If you'd like to call American Renaissance, the telephone number is area code 703-716-0900, and American Renaissance's fax number is area code 703-716-0932. American Renaissance also maintains a website. You may reach it at amren.com, amren.com. There you'll find regular news updates, links to books and publications, as well as an opportunity to email American Renaissance. Renaissance Audio Visual can be contacted at Post Office Box 1543, Marietta, Georgia 30061-1543. If you'd like to email us, you may email us at renaudvis, RENAUDVIS, @AOL.com.